Good afternoon, folks. This is a reminder, short talks will begin in 5 minutes. Short talks will begin in 5 minutes. Please start making your way to your session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back from lunch. Welcome to those of you who are listening in online. My name is Robert Albright. I'm Director of Programs with the Collective Impact Forum. I just wanted to briefly introduce our speaker, and then I'll get off the stage and let Dr. Pearce take it away. But it's a real privilege of mine to introduce Dr. Nicholas Pearce. I'm an alum of Kellogg, Northwestern's School of Management, and it's just a real honor to be able to introduce Dr. Pearce, who has really done a lot of work around values-based leadership. He's a leadership coach. He's a pastor. He's a professor. He wears lots of different hats, and you're going to really enjoy his comments today. So without further ado, I'll invite Dr. Pearce up. Thanks so much.
Thank you. All right, good afternoon. Good to be with you all, and hello for those of you all who are tuning in around the world, whatever time zone you may be in. It is a delight for me to be here with you all today to talk about some thoughts from my recently released book, which is entitled The Purpose Path, a guide to pursuing your authentic life's work. You might think that a conversation like this is not especially necessary in a room like this, full of people who are engaged in the work of making our world a better place, people who are engaged in social impact, people who are devoting 60, 70, 80, 90 hours every week toward making things better for other people. Yet what I have discovered is that there are a lot of people on the planet who are doing good work but are not living free. People who are trapped in their own lives, people who are doing good things but they're not the things that they should be doing. They are chasing after definitions of success that other people have prescribed for them. People are chasing after what I like to think of as the trophies in our capitalistic trophy cases. Bigger homes, faster cars, or perhaps it's not that because you're in the collective impact space. So perhaps you have forsaken such dreams, but you would love to be, you would perhaps love to have your organization cited as a pioneer in a particular methodology or particular approach to social impact. Yet, many of us find ourselves climbing toward goals that are really not ours to pursue. Somebody told you that this was something you should do, and you bought it. And because it's good work and it's helping someone else, you feel that how bad could it be? What's the harm? But for those of you all who have been engaged in this work for any amount of time, you recognize the amount of energy that is required to do this work well. You also understand the amount of time and social capital and human capital and financial capital that is required to do this work well. So my question in writing this book is your life worth living, or would you rather live someone else's life with yours? And if, in fact, you want to live your authentic life, if you want to live the life that you were put here on the planet to live, then what my book attempts to do is give you a bit of guidance around how you can connect your soul with your role. A lot of us leave our souls in the parking lot every day. A lot of us think about doing our work as work, and then we strive for this ever-elusive concept of work-life balance. How many of you all are in the work-life balance camp? How many of you all are in the aspiring to it camp? All right, I think that hit just about every table. The problem is work-life balance is a myth because it suggests that on the one hand you have work, on the other hand you have life. And somehow the secret is to find a way to get these two things to balance. But you know in the work that you're involved in that your work is a critical component of your life. And so it's not about work-life balance, but rather work-life integration. You're trying to be a whole person and do what Parker Palmer calls living an undivided life, where you don't have to partition yourself. I appreciate the introduction that Robert provided at the beginning of this session because it highlighted the work that I'm doing as a professor at Northwestern, as a pastor at a church on the south side of Chicago called the Apostolic Church of God, and the work that I'm doing through a consulting firm that I founded almost a decade ago called the Vocati Group. And for many people, you think about business school professor and pastor as strange bedfellows. And then this consulting piece is like, I really don't know how to make sense of this guy. But the reality is, for me, I don't leave my soul in the parking lot when I go to teach at Kellogg. I don't leave my brain or my scholarship in the parking lot when I go to preach. I don't leave my best and highest values outside when I go into boardrooms, right? And so what I'm trying to do is live an integrated life where I don't have to wear masks and change hats and go back and forth, toggling back and forth between identities. So what I'd like to do with the rest of the time we have together this afternoon is briefly share with you all some thoughts from the book. 5 questions that I ask, and hopefully will guide your ongoing reflection. The book is entitled The Purpose Path, as is this conversation. And I don't call it the purpose destination because I don't believe that purpose is a goal to be achieved. I don't think purpose is the prize at the end of a life well lived. Similarly, I don't believe that purpose is the consolation prize you get when you can't be profitable. Purpose is not the kind of, and for the runner-up, purpose. Purpose is not a runner-up kind of prize. Now, I understand that many of you all are in the nonprofit sector. Not all social impact is not-for-profit, I understand that. Yet, many of you all are in the nonprofit sector. But just because you're in the nonprofit sector does not mean that your organization is trying to operate for loss. Right? Just because it's not for profit doesn't mean for loss. Okay? So this is not to suggest that profitability and purpose are mutually exclusive. In fact, I think they can quite peacefully coexist. So what I do is try to give a set of questions that will guide your ongoing reflection time after time through various seasons of your life. Whether you are a 20-something who is fresh out of school and you're trying to figure out, what do I do with my life? Do I go to graduate school? Do I pursue path A, path B? Or perhaps someone who's in their 30s or 40s or even their 50s who is at a point in their career where they've accomplished a lot of great things, but they're wondering whether they have been climbing a ladder that's leaning against the wrong wall. Or perhaps people who are in their 60s or 70s who are entering what scholars are calling the third of life. And they're wondering, as I approach this season of life where I may have easily 20 or 30 years remaining, how do I make these years count? As the famous quote goes, it's not about the years in your life that count, it's the life in your years. Right? And so there are people who are wrestling with these questions in their third of life, which is why I call this book The Purpose Path. Many of us are very preoccupied with getting from point A to point B, and I would argue that if we're willing to embrace the path we're on and embrace the journey, we'll find that there are very significant and meaningful moments of purpose on the way. Those of you all who are engaged in the work of collective impact in your communities or across this country or even around the world, you will know that while many goals are incredibly elusive, there are meaningful moments that if you pause long enough to see what's happening, purposeful things are happening on the way. And so my encouragement to us is to embrace that journey. 5 questions that I hope will guide our reflection, and then we'll be able to have some conversation with each other. First question that I like to pose is the question, what is success? And this is a huge question because many of us, as I mentioned previously, find ourselves chasing after definitions of success that other people have set for us. Many of us have bought into the myths of what a successful life looks like. Yet, when we look at how we have made things happen, we have scored lots of points on our stakeholders' scorecards. We have scored lots of points in terms of what our teams may want to see or what people in our respective communities may want to see. But there comes a moment when we must look in the mirror and ask ourselves, based on the scorecard of our own souls, how have we done? And this is the question of what is success. It is a question that is as unique to you as your very own fingerprint. And I believe it evolves with time. There is not one set definition. However, I believe that this is a challenge for us to not only let our best and highest values guide how we act at work or how we act in the community or how we act in the marketplace. But going beyond just letting our best and highest values animate how we do what we do, I think there's an opportunity for us to let our best and highest values guide what work we choose to do in the first place. Many of us may come from backgrounds where our parents or grandparents didn't have the luxury of asking, what do I want to be when I grow up? Yet, for those of us who have the luxury of being together either in person or via live stream, talking about collective impact, we do have some degree of choice when it comes to determining what we're going to do with our lives. And so my encouragement to us is to make sure that our best and highest values are animating what work we choose to do so that we won't live lives that are successful by other people's metrics but insignificant by our own. Okay? So that's one question. What is success? And that is as unique to each of us as our own DNA. The second question is the question of who am I? Who am I is a critical question because this really wrestles with identity. Many of us are doing work in the race and equity space, trying to close gaps, whether they're related to race or gender or class or socioeconomics, and we all carry various identities with us. We're mothers and fathers, we're sisters and brothers, daughters and sons, we are husbands and wives and partners, we are Black and Latino and Asian and white and male and female, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Yet, many of us, when we're honest, we're wearing a mask every day. We're going to work fraudulently. Many of us have resigned ourselves to this as a coping mechanism for the craziness called professional life. But I would argue that over time, if you get so comfortable with your mask, your face begins to blend in and meld into that mask, and you become indistinguishable from the representative of yourself that you sent to work. Many of us are fraudulent, if we're honest, because we look at ourselves and we're covering and hiding so many important parts of who we are. This is certainly true in the diversity and inclusion conversation. When we think about covering and the costs of people's inauthenticity in the workplace, do I need to cover the fact that I'm a Muslim in order to not be taunted or teased? Do I need to cover the fact that I'm a woman in order to be able to strive and thrive in the workplace? Do I need to cover my racial identity in order to be perceived as legitimate? Like, these are questions that we all have to grapple with in one way or another, whether as individuals or certainly as leaders. And so the question, who am I, is really inviting us to dig deep and be comfortable in our own skin. This idea of connecting soul with role is not about being ostentatious and coming in, getting in people's faces and saying, here's my truth, so accept me as I am. You talk with your hands, you get in people's face. That's one brand of authenticity. That's also one brand of getting fired. What I would encourage us to think about is authenticity as being comfortable in the skin that we're in and not trying to conform to impress somebody who doesn't even care about us anyway. Now you say, well, why is this an important conversation for this kind of convening? It's because many of us are engaged in heavy lifting, trying to transform the future of society. And if you're going to have to show up every day as someone else, this may be an opportunity for you to come off of autopilot and reorient. Third question, we talked about what is success, who am I? The third question is, why am I here? Right? And this question has been the subject of philosophical thought for centuries. I think of James Watson, who was the co-founder, or co-discoverer, I should say, of the DNA double helix. He won a Nobel Prize for it almost 70 years ago. And he thinks that we are not for anything. Instead, we are simply here to genetically propagate the human species. And as important as that is, speaking as a new father of a toddler, the reality is I believe we're made for more. I believe we're made for more. I believe that we are not just automatons going through this life. I believe that we are born with soul. I believe we are born with meaning-making capacity. I believe that we are born with a desire for the transcendent. And if we buy into the dominant narrative in many organizations today, many of us would walk out of here believing that all we are is worth what we produce. This kind of dehumanization and commoditization of people is running rampant. We see artificial intelligences and machine learning now able to outthink some of the most brilliant human beings on the planet, which means that in order for us to really understand what it means to be human, we have to get beyond this concept that your value as a person is equivalent to the value of what you can produce. When we look at people in the United States currently who make $40,000 a year or less, certain studies would suggest that 5 out of 6 of them in the next 20 years will no longer have their job. They will be replaced by a robot or by artificial intelligences that can out-strategize and outwork and outlast them. So if we're going to equate value with productivity, we've got a significant challenge on our hands. We have to recognize we're human beings, not human doings, and let our being and our becoming infuse our work. We've talked about what is success. We've talked about who am I, why am I here. This question of why I'm here then leads to the next question of what I should do about it. The way I phrase that question in the book is, am I running the right race? The question of am I running the right race certainly connects with the previous question, because while someone like Watson thought that we're just here to propagate the species, other people think that all we're here for is to be happy. And our own personal happiness should be the barometer by which we measure whether our lives were successful or not. Yet, if we put passion or happiness as the chief ends that we are pursuing in this life, I believe that we are setting ourselves up for significant failure. Not only are we setting ourselves up for significant failure, but we're setting up our children and our children's children for significant failure. Because I don't know about you all, but certainly in the work that I do, I have encountered some very difficult moments. I've encountered some early mornings and some late nights and some tough conversations, some inconvenient truths that I've had to articulate at tables that I didn't even know existed. Yet, we recognize that it's not just about our happiness. I'm not suggesting that misery is the goal either. I'm not suggesting that happiness is bad and we should just try to live lives of pure misery and that will be the goal. I am instead saying that using happiness as a goal is a bit deceiving. I would argue that we should use happiness as a byproduct of living a life of purpose. That happiness is a byproduct of doing the work that we're called to do, right? We're doing the work that we're put on the planet to do. And I believe that work is in the area of human flourishing. I believe that each of us has a unique contribution to being able to make societies flourish. That does not mean scale, by the way. Many of us get confused and think that the scale of our impact is equal to the significance of our impact. And I would argue that many people are public successes, but private failures. So it's not about the scale of your impact. Sometimes the most significant impact you can make is in your own house. So this is not about trying to go after scale and awards and recognition. This is really asking in a very deep and sober way, with great humility, why am I here and what can I do about it? Am I running the right race? This is called vocational courage. This is about having clarity about your life's work and then having the commitment to align your daily work with your life's work. You can't say my life's work is this, but here's what I do every day. Somehow they're going to connect cosmically by good intentions. That's not the way this works. What we do every day in aggregate is what we will have done with our lives. And so my encouragement to us is to figure out how to summon the courage to connect what we do every day with what we ought to do with our lives. Lastly, the final question is, am I running the race well? Am I running the race well? This is a question that is designed not just to get us asking why we're on the planet and what we should do, but I believe it's important how we do it. Are we sacrificing our best and highest values for the sake of impact? Are we chasing after numbers and recognition and metrics and data points just for the sake of being able to feel good about ourselves or being able to prove a theory of change so that we can prove to the world we were right about solving some intractable dilemma? Or are we truly allowing ourselves to remain grounded in our best and highest values, not compromising who we are or why we're doing what we're doing to get great things done? Some great things aren't ours to do. Some great things are someone else's to do. And this does not mean that we should phone it in and say, well, you know what, that's not my department. But it does mean that we should be thoughtful about not diminishing ourselves by being complicit with others' dehumanization of ourselves, reducing us to piecemeal productivity, and instead focusing on the very work that we were created and placed here on assignment to do. That's the purpose path in a nutshell. It's a guide to how you can pursue your authentic life's work and ultimately connect your soul with your role to live a life that is not only successful, but significant. Thank you very much. So thank you very much. I'm getting the cue that we have about 10 minutes or so for questions. So I believe there are microphones roaming about. So if you would kindly raise your hand, I'd be delighted to do my best to answer your question. I see a gentleman here in the back, I believe. By the way, these are not going to be answers. These are going to be opinions. Go for it.
Okay. Hello, my name is Irv Hunter. I'm from Bay Area Community Resources. And
How
I'm
are
a
you?
career coach there. Oh, man, I'm doing pretty good. I enjoyed your talk right now. I was just wanting to see if you can elaborate more on the vocational courage.
Sure.
And how did it show up in your life, and how did you find that out?
I appreciate that question. For me, there was a lot that, for the sake of time, was omitted from my bio. I grew up on the south side of Chicago and went to Chicago Public Schools. I met my wife there in 7th grade. Yes, get it out. Met my wife there in 7th grade and went off to MIT to study chemical engineering. And though I completed that degree, I recognized midway through that I had no business being a chemical engineer. I didn't care about chemical and biological systems the same way I cared about people and organizational systems, and that began this pivot towards the doctoral program in management at Kellogg, where I now serve on the faculty. But even then, on that path, there were several decision points around what exactly I was going to be doing after I finished. One track was to be a pure tenure track professor, which would have pulled me out of the church context. Because in parallel, I knew I was called to pastoral ministry when I was 7 years old. So to pursue a tenure track professorship would have essentially pulled me out of the church context and pulled me out of the marketplace, where I actually wanted to work with leaders who were doing things, not just thinking about things. So I knew I needed to carve out a unique path for myself, and I got advice to the contrary, yet, as you heard in the brief bio sketch, I'm doing all three. So that is a quick way of saying vocational courage is something I've had to discover in my own life, because there are costs to this. There are financial costs, there are status costs, power costs, material costs that people don't like to think about. It looks like the story is nice and neat and wrapped up in a bow, because here I am. But I assure you that every day there's injustice to be fought against. And many of that I face in the spheres that I operate in. The idea of vocational courage is, however, being clear on what is yours to do and not letting someone silo you or minimize you based on their expectations and based on their experience. It's having clarity, but a lot of us have clarity on what we're supposed to do, but we aren't doing anything about it. And so it's clarity plus the commitment that is required to do something about what you know is yours to do. Short answer to a very deep question, but I unpack that a bit more in the purpose path. Yes? Microphone's coming.
Oh, thank you. Hi, my name is Laura Ramirez. I'm the executive director of the Chicago Freedom School. So thank you for that. One question I had is, as a woman of color in institutions, right? I was an academic, and it was really hard to see myself in that space. How do you reframe failure so that instead of like backing away from pursuing something that is hard, you allow yourself to use that as a way to maybe drive yourself forward and also create that path that you are talking about? And another kind of related question, how do you know that that's your path?
Got it. Thank you for those questions, plural. Let me try to tackle at least part of what I gathered from your question. The question of how do you deal with the kind of adverse circumstances that you face is an important one. A lot of us, as I mentioned earlier, think of happiness as the goal, which causes us to try to find routes around pain and around adversity. And when we run into a roadblock, we assume that it's a dead end, not something to be navigated around, not something that perhaps opens up a unique detour. I would argue that in a purpose orientation, not just a happiness orientation, that we look at those crushing and painful and devastating moments not as obstacles or as distractions, but rather as critical moments of formation that are going to produce in us a power that would not otherwise be available to us. Sometimes it's those moments that break us and crush us and bring us down that actually release a degree of resilience that we didn't know we had. So part of this is reframing those setbacks and looking at them as opportunities instead of obstacles. Sometimes for people of color, they ask the question, am I enough? Am I worthy of living a life like this, when I'm told I should just be grateful for whatever opportunity is afforded me? And the short answer is, you're made for more. Don't let somebody else minimize you. I don't care what identity you have. Yeah. Question? Yes.
Thanks. My name's Kaylee McLeod, and I am the director of the Philadelphia Coalition on Children and Opioids. So one of the things that I'm hearing that really resonates with a lot of us is I think that so many of us are sort of at a place in our career where we can financially afford to take those risks, where we have a network, a support system that will, lift us up if we happen to fall. How can we encourage younger folks, especially folks of color, to sort of take these risks, but at the same time, I don't want somebody to end up, experiencing homelessness because I encourage them to find their joy.
Exactly. That's real.
So you're right. So how do you help facilitate this in younger folks who may not have the sort of clout and the network and the resources to be able to do something like this, if that makes sense?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. A couple of reflections. One, I think that the risk of living your authentic life is not as great as the risk of dying never having lived. So it's reframing that first. The other is that the call to purpose is not a call to being unwise. For young people, I think there's an especially apt opportunity for them to reframe the purpose of their education. Education, I believe, should not just be preparatory for career. Career comes from a French word that means racetrack. And for those of you all who have been caught up in career navigation, you can attest to that. The word vocation comes from a Latin word meaning calling. And so looking at education as preparatory for calling as opposed to career can lead to a very different set of decisions. Instead of asking kids what they want to be when they grow up, we should ask them who do they want to be and what legacy do they want to have left on the planet? What do they want their life to have stood for? That opens up a completely different educational trajectory. The other thing I would say, whether it's for younger people or people who are mid-career who are saying, I've got a mortgage, I've got kids, I've got bills to pay, how do I pivot? Are you telling me to quit my job tomorrow? Not necessarily. Perhaps the call that you are sensing and wrestling with is first a call to preparation, right? And that first call to preparation means perhaps you need to be looking for other educational opportunities or mentoring opportunities or volunteer opportunities, things that will give you the space to orient yourself in the direction of purpose and not necessarily, as you mentioned, leave your family on the street. It's a real question. Last question, I'm told. No pressure. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not running the questions. The microphone folks are running the questions. I'll stay behind to answer your question. Yes.
Thanks. It's like, hi, I'm Missy with Chicago Cares. We do volunteer mobilization engagement here in Chicago. And a big part of our work is people who are looking for their purpose or want to do good, but are often white or privileged or affluent, and their understanding of their role in doing good is taking up space of other people's roles in that. And so I would just love to hear, and we're retooling a lot of our work to educate them differently on what their role in purpose actually should look like. And I would just love to hear your perspective on how you approach that with folks to like encourage that purpose, but recognize that like your understanding and what the world has told you should be your role may not actually be what's most useful.
Wow, thank you for that. As the clock strikes 0. It's often said that service is the rent we pay to be on the planet. And I believe a lot of leaders and organizations are getting that message all wrong by equating their purposefulness with their philanthropy, and their philanthropy being equated to check writing. I don't believe that a true love for humanity is equivalent to writing a check to an organization to have a dinner in this very ballroom and calling it a day. I don't believe that kind of arm's length love, which is really a tax break and a corporate image boost, is truly demonstrating love of people and love of community. I would argue that purpose should not be relegated to the wealthy few, and it should also not be thought of as a project for those who are disadvantaged or dispossessed. This is not going in and saving folks who are just desperately in need of your salvation. This is doing our best as fellow sojourners to live out this project called humanity the best way we know how, not only focus on our own needs, but also on the needs of others. And sometimes those others are as close as the house next door. Robert. Thank you all.
I'm going to show this real quick. Thank you so much, Dr. Pearce. I wish we could go on for another hour. I did want to just put a quick plug in for his book. There's a link to the book within the session description if you want to learn more about this, so definitely wanted to put in a plug. It's an excellent read. We are now going to transition. They're going to put the slide up right now that just shows you and reminds you where you can go next. We have a pretty short transition here. We'll start with the next round of short talks at 2:15. So you can stay in here if you want to join the conversation that Dr. Helene Gayle is going to have with Lauren Smith. But we also have 2 other short talks. So you can look on your app. I see many of you doing that. You can also see on the screen. So if you want to stay here, that's great. But there's also 2 other great talks that will be starting in just a few minutes in Region CD and in Crystal AB. So thanks again to Dr. Pearce, and we'll see you in a minute.
sure that it's still, can you, I don't know how you can hear.
How are you? Yes, yes, good to see you. Yeah. Is that better? Is that better?
Good afternoon, folks. The second round of short talks will begin in approximately 5 minutes. The second round of short talks will begin in 5 minutes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear? All right, we're ready to start. Maybe I have to stand up. I can't do the taxi whistle, so you all are just gonna have to. Quiet. Thank you. There you go. I keep threatening to get a YouTube video on how to do the taxi whistle, but I haven't done it yet. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Lauren Smith. I'm the co-CEO of FSG, and welcome to this short talk. We are Is that better? All right, tell you what, I'm gonna button it. Hold on, I'm gonna button it so it stays. I'm dressing in front of like 200 people. There's always a first for everything. Okay, is that better? Yes. Awesome, thank you. So my name is Lauren Smith. I'm the co-CEO of FSG, and I'm thrilled that you chose to this particular short talk. We are truly blessed and honored to have Dr. Helene Gayle with us. Her bio is in the conference materials, but let me just tell you that she has been everywhere and done everything. So how about that? She's worked at the CDC. She's worked in philanthropy. She's worked in the social sector at McKinsey Social Innovation. Just such a tremendous amount of and wide variety. She's a pediatrician, which I also am. So of course, I think she's super cool. So it's just the breadth and depth of her experience just gives us tremendous opportunity to tap into that wisdom. She's now the leader, the CEO of the Chicago Community Trust, and it's in that role that she's here and helping to sort of welcome us to Chicago as a city, and we're so thrilled to have you here. Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to start off, first of all, by for thanking you, but then I wanted to, for those of you who don't know, that the Chicago Community Trust, one of the things that you've really made clear in your work recently is around addressing the racial wealth gap. And a couple pieces of information that I will share with you that I found really interesting, that Chicago, third most populous city, is the fifth most racially and economically segregated. And in terms of wealth, and I'm going to follow up with you, for every $100 that a white family has in wealth, so not income, but wealth, a Latinx family has about $12, and a black family has about $10 per that $100. So with that as the kind of sobering context, can you share a little bit about why the Trust has decided to focus on that, and how does collaboration, the type of collaborations that the audience has been involved in, play into that?
Great, thanks. And one other thing you didn't mention is I'm a former board member of FSG.
Yes,
so
I forgot. That was my little secret.
Yeah, so I love FSG and all that it has brought to the world of social impact. So, in some ways, your setup to the question maybe answers the question. I mean, it's a staggering statistics. And we know that not only in Chicago, but also in other parts of the country, in our country, and even in our world, this gap is only growing. And so, I came to the Chicago Community Trust about just under 2 years now. I was new to Chicago, new to community philanthropy. I'd done global and national philanthropy, but new to community philanthropy. And, not surprising, as a new leader, it's an opportunity for an organization to step back and think about what it's done in the past, how you build on that, and then what do you want to do in the future that might continue to evolve the mission of the organization. So the Chicago Community Trust has been around for 104 years. It's one of the oldest community foundations. And I think, like so many community foundations over its history, it's been involved in lots of things that are important civic landmarks for Chicago and the Chicago region. And you name a building, name an institution, et cetera, the Chicago Community Trust has had a real impact. But when we step back and asked ourselves, of all the things we've done, and resources that we provided, were we able to actually talk about a sustainable long-term impact? And I think we feel good about a lot of the things we have done, but we weren't able to say, here's what we stand for, here's who we are, and this is how we're going to measure our progress towards goals. And we thought that as an institution that is perpetual and that will be there, that we should take on some of the most important challenges for Chicago and for the region. And if you look at almost anything, Chicago, unfortunately, people know Chicago because of the challenges that we've had with violence in the recent years. We had at one point an education system that was ranked as one of the worst in the nation. That's changed a lot, but we have really glaring health inequities. If you go from here 5 miles away, the life expectancy drops 16 years. So I can go on and on and on about some of these gaps and some of the social challenges. But at the end of the day, underlying all of that is this persistent and growing wealth gap. And it is built on a legacy, as you mentioned, of sustained segregation. And so we said if we could do something that could in some ways have an impact broadly beyond just taking on one single issue, but something that could have an impact that could really reach far and hopefully have a positive impact on other issues, it was this racial wealth gap. And so, that's what we've said will be our organizational highest priority, and really working on things that we think both build assets, but also reduce debt. Because you have, if you look at wealth, it's the accumulation of how do you use income to generate assets and long-term holdings, but it's also making sure that you're not accumulating debt that only takes away what you may have on the positive ledger. So we're looking at all of those things. And to your point, obviously, we're a large funder in the region. We have a relatively large presence, but we're not going to be able to close the racial wealth gap by ourselves. And the very nature of the problem means that we will need to work in partnership with the private sector, with the public sector, with others in philanthropy, with the nonprofit sector to really be able to make a dent in this issue. But it's something we're committed to doing.
Well, one of the interesting things that I mentioned to you, there's 800, folks who've come to this conference, which is tremendous, and includes folks who are playing the role as backbone, funders, practitioners, people who have nonprofits, et cetera. So there's, quite a wealth of and a heterogeneous kind of experience that are among the folks that you're listening to. But across all that is this idea of the cross-sector or multi-sector collaboration. So everyone here is here because they're playing some sort of role in that kind of work, and you just sort of alluded to that. I'm wondering, what is both, as you've been doing this work with the Chicago Community Trust, but you've also had the vantage point of looking at cross-sector work in many of your other roles that you've had. And I'm wondering if you could share with folks what you feel like are the keys to success, or what really needs to be present for it to be successful, and how are you thinking about that for the trust work?
Well, first, I think it's making sure that you do have a shared vision. That seems simple and straightforward, but as anybody who has ever tried to develop a collaboration knows, getting on the same page, because we all have our own institutional strategies, we all have our own institutional ways of working, ways of defining issues, and just taking that time up front to really make sure you're talking the same language and about the same problem. And I think anybody in the room who's worked on social impact issues knows that you can sit in a room, use certain words, think that you're talking about the same thing, and then walk out of the room and realize we were in 2 different or 3 different conversations. So I think first and foremost it really is getting on the same page and taking the time to actually do that. and taking the time and being willing to be open and candid enough about, hidden agendas and what are the things that, might be getting in the way of true collaboration. Then I think, really looking at what does each partner bring to the table? Because we all have different assets, we all have different things that are our comparative advantage. And I think one of the things, and again, I think FSG has been so great in, talking about collective impact in helping to define, I think there was a time when if you wanted to have social impact and talk about, doing social change work, you worked with organizations like yourself. It was more comfortable, it's who you knew. But I think increasingly we're realizing that it is by working with organizations that bring something very different to the table that you actually have true, additionality, if you will. And so, again, I think it adds to the burden and the challenge because we have different ways of doing work, different incentive structures, different language, all those things. I think I just tell a somewhat funny story. When I was at CARE and we were working on work around financial inclusion in poor communities, and one of the financial institutions, I think it was Visa, was one of our big partners. And we were really working on how do you get the unbanked into formal banking systems. And so, we were talking with our colleagues and our counterparts, and the guy said, when I talk to my partners, the people in Visa, about financial inclusion, their eyes glaze over. But when I talk to them about 1 billion new customers, all of a sudden they get it. So, sometimes when you're working in these kinds of partnerships where people have very different incentive bases, very different ways of thinking about it, you've got to take that time to struggle. But I think in the end, we could never have done what we wanted to do had we not had, a partner who is in the financial industry. And we could have done all the work we wanted at the community, on the community level, getting people ready and preparing them, but we needed them. And so I think it's that coming together with people who are more unlike you. Somebody has used the phrase, the maximum tolerated difference. How different can you get, and how much can you, get to before it's the breaking point? And I think it's when you look at it that way that you really have that kind of complementarity.
I heard a little chuckle. I bet all of you are sort of, is there an assessment I could do of the maximum tolerated difference? And am I pinned in the red zone of that right now in my current work? You mentioned something that I wanted to just follow up on, which was the taking the time to develop those relationships to get to the point where people can do that. How have you seen it effectively balance the tension between taking the time to do exactly what you said, because I think everyone agrees that that would be important, and the sense of urgency and sense of a need to get something done, that something has to change soon because people are suffering, people are experiencing things right now. And so how do you balance those two? I imagine that tension is present in a lot of the work that we all are doing.
Yeah, there's an African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I mean, I really do believe that is the case. When you do something out of haste, that doesn't mean that you're not, that makes you feel like you're responding to the urgency. But at the end, when we're talking about these kind of very difficult, complex challenges, it's the haste is not equivalent to urgency. I think urgency actually demands of us to be thoughtful about what we do, demands of us to put the kinds of resources and the kind of time into it because they are complex issues. So, I think it is in balancing that. But I also think, looking at how do you look at both short and long-term goals, because we've been well, we've been in strategic planning. My staff will probably say strategic planning hell for the last 18 months.
For some people, that's like that's synonym.
Yeah, right, exactly. You know, but we've really taken the time to be very deliberate about what we're doing. But in the meantime, you know, there's some quick wins. There are things that we know are directionally where, you know, in the aligned with where we're going that may not be perfect, but we can get some things started. So I think it's how do you get some things started while in the meantime you want to make sure you're taking the time to be deliberate about, you know, pulling together partnerships, thinking strategically about where you can really, where are there levers for change, and recognizing that, you know, look at a problem like the racial wealth gap. It wasn't created yesterday. It's not going to be solved tomorrow.
Well, we were very fortunate. We had pre-conferences before the official start of this conference with both a funder track and a backbone track. And in terms of a question I have for you that was raised during the conversations on the funder and foundation track, as someone who's been on both sides of that relationship, what advice or reflections would you have for the funders that are in the room regarding how they can be more effective in their support of multi-sector collaborations, these collective actions kind of work?
I think first and foremost, fund it. You know, nobody.
All right, everyone write that down. Okay, there you go.
You know, collaboration takes time. Okay. You know, and it takes staffing and it takes resources. And we ask people to collaborate, but don't fund them for the collaboration. That's a person, that's time, that's actually, and so I think as funders, if we want collaboration, we're going to have to think about how do we resource it appropriately and be realistic about the fact that you can't do that as a side job. You can't do that as, you know, when you get your other work done, because you got a full-time job. Taking the time to do what we've talked about really does require both the time, but it also requires oftentimes different skills than what the people that we're often asking to do that. And so, you know, you may be excellent as, you know, a program officer who is good at generating ideas, working with grantees, reviewing grants, et cetera, but you may not be the person who is the networker in the same way, or the person who is able to think about, you know, kind of peripheral vision about how do you keep all parties moving in one direction. So it may not be the same skill set even of the person who you may be asking to really structure collaboration. So I think we have to be aware of all of those things.
Well, there was a lot of head nodding when you were talking.
Well, I will say one thing. You know, I started my career as a government funder, and then I went to private philanthropy. Thought I would go to my grave never having to raise any resources, and then, you know, got called to do a job that was wonderful, where I had to do a lot of raising of resources. And I will say, it was the most valuable experience for me to be on the other side of the check and understand what we as funders oftentimes put grantees through. And so I just think that everybody who is a funder should take some time raising resources and understand that side of it. I think I come back into philanthropy a much better philanthropist and funder than had I not had that experience.
Give us two things that you learned that you said, oh, I'm not going to do that when I get back on the other side of the check.
Well, I think general operating funds, for instance. You know, we funders tend to be great at providing project-specific funding. We've got our strategies, and we say, you know, you align with our strategies, and you know, we want you to do this, and if you do this, you get our grant. But we don't think about the platform that we want to deliver that project. And I think, you know, being able to provide general operating support, you know, for things that aren't necessarily even closely aligned to a particular project. I mean, we all have very antiquated IT systems. We would be a lot better if we could actually have modern day technology. So just as an example, but I think there's so many ways in which we could help build the organizations who we want to have the results, and I think we could do a better job of that. I think the other thing is recognizing, when you have been a major funder for an organization and you shift directions, that you've got to make sure that you're giving people enough time to figure out how they, kind of make that switch if you're no longer going to do that. And we switch our strategies, and I don't think give enough lead time and work with organizations enough to make sure that we're not putting at peril what may be a mission that is no longer aligned with where you're going, but still a very important mission.
So sort of providing for that transition sort of period. Let me have one more question, and we're going to then pivot to having some questions from the audience. So start thinking about what you want to ask. Let me ask you one more question. So you mentioned a list of thorny problems in Chicago, the complex, really wicked problems that you all at the Trust are sort of getting after. Do you have thoughts for the group about how, for folks who are looking to either establish or deepen their partnerships with other players who have to be involved to successfully tackle those kinds of thorny problems, what advice do we give people who are looking to do that, who may not have the relationships yet, or may have started with the relationships, but they need to be taken to another level?
I'm not sure.
So what advice do you have for the folks here for how they can approach building partnerships that they need to attack these complex problems? Either starting new partnerships with folks that they haven't had connections with, or repairing or deepening, relationships with folks that they may have already had some connection with.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure if I have a great answer. I think one of the things that, as we take on more and more difficult challenges, and recognizing that partnership is a part of it, I think it does mean that organizations need to shift their thinking about their roles and realize that there may be a more external role than organizations often think about. I think people, you're running an organization or you're part of an organization, you think about your internal mission and don't always think about, all right, who do I need to align with? And I just think it does mean it's a different way of thinking and different, even different skill set. And I think about the wonderful work that you did on being the change. And I won't remember all of the different elements of it, but it was one of the things that we really have been using a lot as we've been going through our own thinking about our evolution as an organization. And kind of going from grant maker to change maker, and how do you really need to think about your work beyond, are you really doing a great job of getting grants out the door and administering grants, which is really good, or are you using your whole organization and your voice, looking at policy and advocacy, strategic communications, all of those sort of things that I think an organization needs to start shifting to as we work in this world that is much more collaborative and thinking very different about how you link to other organizations. And more and more there are affinity groups that are bringing different partners together, and so being parts of those affinity groups and thinking about really who, given what you do and given what you do well, what else do you need, and then seeking that. It's another reason why I think we'll benefit as an organization from having decided that we have a particular organizational focus, because it helps us to then know who we link with. And so I think defining who you are is the first step in thinking about who do you want to work with, and then I think it makes it easier to kind of look for those partners by knowing more who you are, what you do well, and then what do you need to complement that.
Got it. So having a good sense of self to be able to identify where your skills and assets are, and then where you need the complement.
Yeah, and I would just give another example, and then I know we want to go to audience questions, but, when I was at CARE, and, CARE's overall mission is fighting global poverty, and when I came on, the organization was in the process of kind of pivoting to really putting empowering girls and women at the core of its mission, because we know girls and women disproportionately impacted by poverty, but also if you can invest in a girl or woman, you really have a much greater opportunity to kind of break that cycle by investing in girls and women. And so we knew that, and we were making that pivot. Well, it allowed us to then, as opposed to kind of general global poverty writ large, think about, all right, if we're going to really focus on girls and women as kind of our core, who are the other groups who are working on that? They may or may not be global poverty organizations, but they may be women's organizations that would help us, in our mission. And so just as an example, or they might be, if we were focusing on, women and economic opportunity, they may be economic opportunity organizations. So I think by having that definition, it does help you to think about, who are your natural partners, and how do you go about, identifying them.
And some of them might be new to you because
Exactly.
you wouldn't
Right.
have nor ordinarily identified them as being potential partners.
Right.
So we have time for a few questions, 2 or 3 questions. So I see you here in the front. There's a microphone winging its way to you.
My colleague from Milwaukee.
Yes, ma'am. I was going to say, Danae Davis, Milwaukee Succeeds. And I am just so utterly, like can't even say enough about how excited I am that you're choosing addressing the racial wealth gap as the focus. Because we've heard the data about, particularly among the gap between black and white. So could you just elaborate on at least 1 or 2 where you're thinking you're gonna, focus in that area of closing that gap, since it's predicted to be pretty dire by 2050?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, we're still kind of in the process of elaborating some of the very detailed, but as an example, career pipelines, very important. Getting a job and keeping a job and having a job that has the likelihood of actual progression, a living wage, et cetera, is an important part of how you then can translate income into wealth. We know that home ownership is a way in which people in this country, when allowed, have actually been able to accumulate wealth. So we're looking at home ownership and also things like affordable housing, because if you've got to pay 70% of the income that you earn in housing, you're not going to be able to accumulate. But we're also looking at policy issues, and increasingly looking at policy levers. And here in this city, for instance, the very discriminatory fines and fees put people into huge debt. We have a predatory lending industry here that again really leads to very poor financial outcomes. So we're looking both at where can we, and then entrepreneurship, and particularly helping to start small and medium-sized businesses in disinvested communities where getting access to credit or capital in multiple forms has not been readily available. So how can we make sure that capital flows are going to some of the communities where economic opportunity and growth has suffered in the last few decades? So we're looking at that as well. So I think both on the kind of what can we do programmatically, but also really looking at policies. Things like expanding the earned income tax credit, huge. We're also looking at the potential of a universal basic income pilot, because we know that just cash and giving people the ability to have cash and what that means can be huge. So these are just some of the ideas we're tossing around. I will say one other thing back to one of your earlier questions. While that's kind of thematically where we're focusing, we also are looking at building capacities in 2 ways. One, how are we strengthening assets in communities, and particularly communities where they have not traditionally had kind of the kinds of networks and social capital that's so important for economic opportunities. So really looking at strengthening social capital. And then the other one is really how do we do some of the things we're talking about in the social impact sector? How do we bring partners together? How do we strengthen the ability for nonprofits to work with government, to work with the private sector, and really look at those kinds of opportunities for organizations to work more and catalyze change. So we're also, while that's kind of thematically, social capital and strengthening the social impact sector is also a part of where we want to put our focus.
Wow, excellent. So it looks like we have time for one more question. Looking. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brian Frank. I'm a family medicine doctor. I work in Portland, Oregon. And I also do research trying to engage the business community around investing in specifically health equity by trying to develop a business case. And I'm finding, I guess I'm wondering from you, our research is trying to have those conversations between sectors that don't always happen. How do you navigate the funding landscape to try and identify groups that are looking to have those conversations or to engage with those conversations?
Right behind you is my colleague who has a health foundation you can talk to. Yeah, I think more and more, I don't know, I can't give an exact answer. I will say that I think the issue of health equity is becoming more and more important, and I think there's more resources going to look at those issues. The Institute of Medicine put out a report not too long ago that I was involved in on looking at community action to address health inequities, funded by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Robert Wood Johnson has really probably been, besides being the largest health funder, has put health equity at the core of what they do. So, they may be one source to start looking at, and then thinking, they may have other resources around who might be, in your particular area, interested in those issues.
They have a whole project, as I'm sure you're aware of, building a culture of health, and one of the aspects of that is sort of bridging between the business and corporate community and sort of ways that they can participate and contribute to building a culture of health. So there's some interesting work happening there. I'm getting the sense by your presence that means our time is up.
Let's give a hand to both doctors, Dr. Smith and Dr. Gayle. I just wanted to, again, thank you both so much, and also just give a couple of quick logistical notes about where we're headed next. So you all can certainly make your way off the stage, but there should be a slide coming up that gives you the schedule for the next round of conversations. We're giving you a lot of content today. You do get a hearty break for the next 30 minutes, so we're not going to jump straight into it, but I did want you all to see what's coming up for our next round. They're called tool sessions. They're going to be 2 rounds, so what's on the slide is just round 1. And there's some of those sessions are going to be repeated in rounds 1 and 2. So I'll just leave this slide up, but there's a whole nother second round that will follow for those of you who are diehard and can hang with us for the rest of the day. So please do respect the folks who are doing sessions this afternoon. I know they'd love to have your presence there. So we've got a break. There's a lot of coffee and snacks and whatnot in the hallway, and then we'll get started again at 3:15. So thanks so much.